Hey there, tonight we're going somewhere cold, bone-chillingly, devastatingly, historically cold. We're stepping into winter in medieval Europe, a season that didn't just inconvenience people, it killed them, slowly, brutally, and without mercy. If you think you know what winter means because you've scraped ice off your windshield or dealt with a broken furnace, think again. The medieval winter was a different beast entirely. So grab your warmest blanket, settle in, and let's ease into this frozen journey together. Because tonight you're about to discover why medieval people didn't just endure winter, they survived it. Barely. Congratulations, you've just been transported to the year 1320, somewhere in rural England. It's January. You're alive, which honestly at this point in winter is already an achievement. But being alive and living well are two completely different things in the Middle Ages. Around you, the landscape has transformed into something alien and hostile. Fields that were golden with grain in autumn now lie buried under snow, their boundaries erased by drifts that reach your chest. Trees stand skeletal and black against a sky the colour of old iron. The sun, when it bothers to appear at all, hangs low and weak on the horizon, offering light but precious little warmth. It rises late, around 8 in the morning, and by 4 in the afternoon, darkness is already reclaiming the world. But it's not just the short days that make medieval winter unbearable. It's the relentless, inescapable cold that penetrates everything. Modern people think of winter as an inconvenience. You turn up the thermostat, pull on a coat, maybe scrape some ice. For medieval Europeans, winter was a months-long siege where the enemy was the weather itself, and surrender meant death. This wasn't the cosy, firelit winter of Christmas cards. This was survival mode, from November until April if you were lucky. Let's talk about the climate, because understanding what made medieval winters so brutal requires looking at the bigger picture. For most of the High Middle Ages, roughly from 900 to 1300, Europe enjoyed what historians call the medieval warm period. During these centuries, temperatures were actually milder than they'd been in generations. Crops grew at higher altitudes. Grapes ripened in England far north of where they grow today. The Norse settled Greenland, giving it that optimistic name because parts of it actually were green and capable of supporting small farming communities. People expanded into new lands, cleared forests, built new villages. Population grew. Life, relatively speaking, was good. But around 1300, everything changed. The climate began shifting toward what scientists now call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that would last, with variations until the mid-1800s. Average temperatures dropped by about 0.6 degrees Celsius across the northern hemisphere. That doesn't sound like much until you realise what it meant on the ground. Growing seasons shortened by weeks. Glaciers in the Alps advanced, creeping down mountain valleys and destroying villages. Winters became longer, harsher, and far more unpredictable. The change happened gradually at first, moving from northwest to southeast across Europe. The Vikings in Greenland felt it earliest, in the 1290s. England experienced the effects by around 1300. The Mediterranean regions didn't feel the full impact until after 1320. The transition period, roughly 1310 to 1330, was particularly catastrophic. These were the years when medieval Europe got hit with some of the worst weather it had seen in centuries. Brutal cold winters were followed by cold, wet summers that rotted crops in the fields, storms battered coastlines, rivers flooded, and then came winter again, colder and longer than before, arriving early and leaving late. The Gulf Stream, that great ocean current that keeps northern Europe warmer than it should be given its latitude, had slowed. Atlantic storms became more frequent and more severe. Snow that once melted by March now lingered into May. Ice that had never formed on certain rivers now froze them solid for months. This was the world medieval people had to endure, not for a week, not for a season, but for generations. Children born after 1300 would grow old never knowing the mild winters their grandparents had enjoyed, And during the worst years, particularly during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, winter wasn't just hard, it was apocalyptic. You need to understand something else about medieval winters. They were unpredictable in ways that made them even more dangerous. One winter might be merely miserable, with temperatures hovering just around freezing and enough snow to make travel difficult. The next winter, temperatures might plunge so low that rivers froze solid, livestock died in their stalls, and people huddled around inadequate fires wondering if they'd see spring. This variability meant you could never really prepare. You could salt away meat, store grain, gather firewood, and still find yourself caught off guard by a winter that was worse than anything you'd planned for. The North Atlantic Oscillation, a climate pattern that influences European weather, swung wildly during this period, bringing exceptionally cold winters interspersed with slightly milder ones. But even the milder winters of the Little Ice Age were harsher than what most modern people in developed countries ever experience. We're talking about winters where indoor temperatures, even with a fire burning, barely rose above freezing, where your water pitcher froze solid overnight, even inside your house, where frostbite was a constant threat, not from spending hours outside, but simply from living your normal life. Medieval chroniclers recorded these winters with a mixture of awe and horror. In 1408, snow fell continuously for weeks, and thousands of birds dropped dead from the sky, frozen in flight. In 1434, the winter was so severe that the Thames River in London froze solid enough for markets to be held on the ice. In 1565, ships became trapped in ice off the coasts of the North Sea for months. These weren't once-in-a-lifetime events. They happened repeatedly, each generation experiencing multiple winters that pushed survival to its absolute limits. And it's important to note that this cold wasn't distributed evenly. Northern Europe, particularly Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Low Countries got hit hardest. Winters there could see temperatures drop well below freezing for weeks on end. Southern Europe fared somewhat better, but even the Mediterranean saw snow and frost that residents had never experienced before. The variability also meant that some regions might escape relatively unscathed one year, only to be devastated the next. So when you imagine yourself in medieval winter, don't picture a picturesque snow scene with jolly villagers, ice skating and drinking mulled wine. Picture this instead, a world where the cold is your constant enemy, where every day is a battle to stay warm enough to function, where illness and death lurk in every draught and every damp corner. Picture a time when the sun's warmth is so weak it barely seems worth the effort of rising, when darkness dominates your life for 18 hours a day, and when spring is so far away it might as well be a myth. This was medieval winter, and you're about to experience every frozen, miserable moment of it. The church bell clangs in the distance, muffled by thick air and the snow piled against the walls of your hovel. It's your alarm clock, announcing that dawn has technically arrived, though you'd never know it from the darkness still pressing against the cracks in your walls. You open your eyes, or try to. Your eyelashes are stuck together with frost. The moisture from your breath has condensed and frozen during the night, coating your face with a thin layer of ice. You blink hard, breaking the tiny icicles, and immediately wish you hadn't woken up. The cold hits you like a physical blow. It's not the kind of cold where you feel chilly and reach for an extra blanket. It's the kind of cold that makes your joints ache before you've even moved, that makes your lungs hurt with every breath, that seeps into your bones and makes you feel ancient even if you're only 25. And you are 25, which in medieval terms makes you middle-aged, especially after surviving who knows how many winters like this one. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a pile of straw that you share with your spouse, your 3 children who haven't died yet, and possibly a cousin who showed up last autumn and never left. The straw is old, probably hasn't been changed since before the first snow, and it's damp from the collective moisture of too many bodies breathing in too small a space. Somewhere in this pile of humanity and hay, you can feel the warmth of other bodies, and you're reluctant to leave it. But nature calls, and lying here won't make the day any shorter. You sit up slowly, careful not to disturb the wool blanket that everyone's sharing. It's heavy as a dead sheep, which it basically is, since it's made from unprocessed wool that still carries the lanolin, the dirt, the smell, and approximately 3 pounds of accumulated filth. It hasn't been washed since you got it 2 winters ago. Washing it would require heating enough water to soak it, and water heated on your small fire would take days. Besides, everyone says that the dirt and oil actually help keep you warm, forming an extra layer of insulation. You're not entirely convinced, but you're also not about to test the theory by washing it and potentially freezing to death. The floor is dirt packed hard by years of feet, and as your bare feet touch it, you gasp. It's like stepping onto a slab of ice. Actually, in some spots, it is ice. The damp from your bodies, from cooking, from the animals sharing your space, has condensed on the floor overnight and frozen solid. Your feet, already suffering from a mild case of frostbite you got last week, when you had to walk to the neighbouring village, scream in protest. You fumble around in the dark for your shoes if you own any. Most peasants don't. Shoes are expensive, leather is valuable, and unless you're travelling or working in particularly harsh conditions, bare feet or at best some cloth wrappings are what you get. As your eyes adjust to the gloom, you can make out the interior of your home. It's one room, maybe 15 feet on a side if you're lucky, with walls made of wattle and daub. The wattle is woven sticks and branches, and the daub is a mixture of mud, dung and straw that's supposed to seal the gaps. But winter has been hard on the daub. Cracks have appeared, letting in tiny streams of icy air that whistle through the darkness. You made a mental note months ago to fix those cracks, but fixing them requires mud that isn't frozen solid. And besides, when exactly were you supposed to find time for home repairs when every daylight hour is spent trying not to starve? The ceiling is thatched, which is good for keeping rain out in summer, less good for keeping snow out in winter. Some snow has found its way through and melted, then frozen again, creating icicles that hang down into your living space. More concerning is the frost on the inside of the thatch. When the morning sun finally hits the roof, that frost will melt and drip down, turning your home into a damp, cold nightmare. But that's a problem for later. Right now, you have more immediate concerns. You need to get dressed, which sounds simple until you remember what getting dressed means in medieval winter. You're already wearing most of your clothes because you slept in them. Stripping naked at night would be suicide, so you sleep in your linen undertunic, or you would if you had one. Many peasants don't bother with undergarments because linen, while breathable and relatively comfortable, is expensive. So you sleep in your wool tunic, the same one you wear every single day, the one that's starting to develop holes at the elbows and smells like smoke, sweat, animal, and things you'd rather not think about. Getting dressed means adding layers. You have a second wool tunic, heavier than the first, that you pull over your head. It's stiff with cold and dirt, and putting it on is like donating yourself with a frozen, scratchy cocoon. Then comes your cloak, if you have one. It's wool too, because everything is wool. Wool is miraculous stuff, actually. Even wet, it retains some insulating properties, which is crucial because you're going to be damp for the next 4 months. The cloak is supposed to have a hood, but the hood fell off last winter, and you never got around to sewing it back on, so now it's just a heavy rectangular blanket you wrap around your shoulders. Mittens would be nice. Some people have mittens made from scraps of wool, or if they're wealthy, lined with fur. You don't have mittens. You have hands, raw and chapped, and already showing signs of frostbite around the fingertips. They hurt constantly. A burning, itching, throbbing pain that never quite goes away. You've lost some feeling in your left thumb, which is worrying, but there's nothing to be done about it. Medieval medicine doesn't have much to say about frostbite beyond try not to get it, and pray it doesn't turn gangrenous. Your head needs covering too, because you lose a tremendous amount of body heat through your scalp. You have a wool cap, shapeless and ratty, that you pull down over your ears. It doesn't cover your ears completely, and your earlobes are already permanently red and swollen from mild frostbite. The cap is also home to a thriving colony of lice, but lice are a fact of life. Everyone has them. They're warm at least, or they feel warm as they crawl across your scalp, which is better than nothing. Now you're dressed. 4 layers of wool, All of them dirty, all of them reeking, none of them quite enough to keep you truly warm. You look around at your family still huddled under the communal blanket. Your spouse is awake, staring at the ceiling with that blank expression people get when they're trying to will themselves into moving. Your children are still asleep, bundled together like a litter of puppies. The smallest one, barely 2 years old, is coughing in her sleep. That cough started 3 days ago. It might be nothing. It might be pneumonia, which kills children in winter with terrifying efficiency. There's nothing you can do about it either way except hope. But before you can deal with any of that, you need to address the fire, or what's left of it. In the centre of the room, in a shallow pit lined with stones, are the embers of last night's fire. Keeping the fire going all night is critical, but also nearly impossible. Wood is precious. You've spent months gathering deadfall from the forest, breaking up old stumps, scavenging branches, and hoarding every scrap of burnable material you can find. The local lord owns the forest, and technically you're not allowed to take wood without permission, but everyone does it anyway because the alternative is freezing to death. You've been caught twice and fined both times. Fines you paid with grain you couldn't afford to give up, but what choice did you have? The embers are barely glowing, just a faint orange glow beneath a layer of ash. You kneel beside the fire pit, your knees protesting on the frozen floor, and blow gently on the embers. Your breath condenses in the air, adding to the moisture in the room. The embers brighten slightly. You add a few pieces of kindling, tiny scraps of wood and dried grass that you've been saving. They catch, reluctantly, sending up a thin wisp of smoke that immediately gets caught in the downdraft from the hole in the roof and swirls back down into the room. This is one of the great paradoxes of medieval winter heating. You desperately need fire to survive, but the smoke from that fire is slowly killing you. Most peasant homes don't have chimneys, just a hole in the roof that's supposed to let smoke out. In calm weather, this works tolerably well. In winter, when winds howl and temperatures plunge, the smoke has nowhere to go. It fills your home, making your eyes water and your throat burn, coating everything in a layer of greasy soot. You're breathing smoke basically all the time, and it's wreaking havoc on your lungs. Medieval skeletons show extensive damage consistent with chronic smoke inhalation. Respiratory disease is one of the leading killers in winter, and the very thing you need to stay warm is contributing to it. Once the fire is going, you add larger pieces of wood, rationing carefully. You need the fire to last all day because starting it again from scratch is difficult and time-consuming. You need the fire for warmth, for cooking, for light, and for the psychological comfort of knowing it's there. But every piece of wood you burn is one piece you won't have tomorrow or next week or in February when the cold is even worse. It's a constant calculation, balancing today's needs against tomorrow's uncertainty. The fire gradually warms the immediate area around it, creating a tiny bubble of relative comfort in a sea of cold. But the heat doesn't spread far. 3 feet from the fire, temperatures are barely above freezing. Against the walls, it's colder than outside because the walls are damp, and damp cold is worse than dry cold. The smoke thickens as the fire grows, and soon you're all coughing, eyes streaming, but at least you can see now. Dim, smoky, flickering light replaces absolute darkness. Your spouse is up now, moving stiffly, adding their own coughs to the chorus. Together you need to deal with the morning's necessities, starting with water. Water in winter is its own special challenge. The well in the village, assuming it hasn't frozen solid, is a 10-minute walk away. You have a wooden bucket and someone needs to go fetch water because you used the last of it yesterday. The bucket is frozen to the ground where you set it down last night, and you have to kick it several times to free it. Going outside is like being slapped in the face by an angry giant. The cold is so intense it feels violent. Your first breath sears your lungs, making you double over coughing. The wind, which wasn't noticeable inside, cuts through your layers of wool like they're not even there. The sky's just beginning to lighten, a sickly grey that promises nothing resembling warmth. Snow covers everything, shin deep, turned crusty and hard by repeated freezing and thawing. Walking through it is exhausting. You trudge toward the well, passing other hovels identical to yours. Smoke rises from some of them, thin and weak. Others show no signs of life. You wonder if the families inside are still alive or if they've succumbed to the cold, the hunger, or the disease that winter brings. You'll find out eventually. Bodies in winter don't decompose quickly, so they can lie undiscovered for weeks. Someone will eventually notice the smell or the lack of smoke, or the children will fail to appear for church and the village will discover another family claimed by winter. The well is covered with a wooden lid to keep snow out, and several other villagers are already there, waiting their turn. You exchange nods, but not words. Talking requires energy that no one has to spare. The well water is viciously cold, and drawing it up requires hauling on a frozen rope that tears at your bare hands. The water that finally sloshes into your bucket is so cold it's almost slushy. You'll need to let it warm by the fire before you can drink it, because drinking water this cold can send you into shock. Walking back is harder because now you're carrying weight. The bucket is heavy, and the water sloshes with every step, some of it splashing out to freeze on your already soaked tunic. By the time you reach your door, your hands are numb, your feet are numb, and you're shivering so violently you can barely hold the bucket. You duck inside, and even your smoke-filled, barely warm hovel feels like a haven. This is your morning. You've been awake maybe an hour, and you're already exhausted. You've accomplished getting dressed, starting a fire, and fetching water. You haven't eaten yet. You haven't dealt with the children. You haven't fed the animals. You haven't started any of your actual work for the day. And it's only January. You have 3 more months of this at least before winter even begins to loosen its grip. Welcome to a medieval winter morning. You're off to a great start. Let's talk about your house, because calling it a house is almost generous. If you're a peasant, which statistically you absolutely are, your home is what historians politely call a modest dwelling. You'd probably call it something less polite if complaining, didn't require energy you don't have. But modest or not, it's yours, and more importantly, it's shelter. Sort of. The typical peasant home in medieval Europe is constructed using a method called wattle and daub, which sounds almost quaint until you understand what it actually means. Wattle is a framework of woven sticks and branches, like a basket on a much larger scale. You start by driving vertical stakes into the ground, then weave horizontal branches between them, creating a lattice. It's surprisingly strong actually, and if you know what you're doing you can make walls that will stand for years. The daub is what makes it weatherproof, in theory. Daub is a mixture of clay, mud, straw and dung, sometimes with animal hair mixed in for extra binding. You smear this mixture onto both sides of the wattle, filling in all the gaps, creating walls that are typically only 4 to 6 inches thick. When daub is fresh and properly maintained, it actually works fairly well. It provides insulation, keeps out most of the wind, and in summer it even helps keep the interior cool. But winter is brutal on daub. As temperatures drop below freezing, then rise slightly, then drop again, the daub expands and contracts. Cracks appear, small at first, then larger. Water gets into these cracks, freezes, expands, and makes the cracks worse. By midwinter, your walls are less solid barriers and more like sieves, letting in cold air through hundreds of tiny gaps. Repairing the daub requires warm weather and dry conditions, neither of which winter provides. You can try to stuff the cracks with straw or cloth, but these are temporary fixes at best. The wind finds every gap, every weakness, every tiny opening, and exploits it ruthlessly. Medieval people describe this as living in a constant draft, but that's understating it. It's more like living inside a wind instrument, where every gap produces its own whistle or moan, creating a symphony of misery that never stops. The roof is another weak point. Thatching, the most common roofing material for peasant homes, consists of bundles of straw, reeds, or rushes laid in overlapping layers and secured to a wooden frame. A good thatch roof, properly made and maintained, can last 20 years and will shed rain beautifully. But thatch has some serious drawbacks in winter. Snow piles up on it, adding tremendous weight. A thick layer of wet snow can weigh hundreds of pounds, straining the timbers underneath and sometimes causing partial collapses. You need to get up on your roof periodically to clear the snow, which is both dangerous and exhausting. More insidious is what happens at the boundary between the warm interior and the cold exterior. Your body heat, your fire, the animals you're keeping inside for their warmth, all of this produces moisture that rises and condenses on the inside of the thatch. This moisture freezes, creating a layer of ice inside your roof. During the day, when the weak winter sun warms the roof, slightly, this ice melts and drips down, creating an indoor rain that makes everything damp. Damp is your enemy in winter. Damp cold is far more dangerous than dry cold because water conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than air does. The floor is packed earth, which in summer is fine, but in winter becomes a cold sink. No matter how much you try to insulate it with straw or rushes, the cold from the frozen ground below seeps up through it. Your feet are constantly cold, contributing to the epidemic of frostbite and chilblains that plague medieval people every winter. Some wealthier peasants have wooden boards covering part of their floor, which helps tremendously, but wood is expensive and not everyone can afford it. Now let's address the question of heat. How do you warm a medieval home? The answer for the vast majority of the population is a fire pit. Right in the middle of the floor you have a shallow depression, maybe a foot deep and 3 feet across, lined with stones if you have them, bare earth if you don't. This is your hearth, your heating system, and your stove all in one. You build a fire in this pit and hope for the best. The physics of fire pit heating are not in your favour. Heat rises, which means most of your heat is going straight up and out the hole in your roof. What heat does radiate outward warms the air immediately around the fire, but air is a terrible conductor of heat. The result is that you're warm on the side facing the fire and cold on the side facing away. You spend all winter rotating slowly like a rotisserie chicken, trying to warm all sides of yourself evenly. It never works. You're always too hot on one side and too cold on the other, and the transition zone between hot and cold gives you a headache. The smoke situation is even worse than the heat situation. Wood smoke contains particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and various toxic compounds. You're breathing this constantly. Your eyes water, your throat burns. Your lungs, already compromised by repeated winter illnesses, struggle with the additional insult of chronic smoke exposure. Analysis of medieval skeletons shows extensive damage to nasal passages and lung tissue consistent with decades of smoke inhalation. This contributes directly to the high rates of respiratory disease and the relatively short life expectancy of medieval people. Some homes, particularly in Scandinavian regions where winters are even harsher, use a slightly more sophisticated system. They have stone-lined fire pits that retain heat better, and they've positioned them near the centre of the room where the thermal mass of the stones helps radiate warmth more evenly. The Vikings actually developed a fairly efficient system with long, narrow hearths that could heat a considerable space. But for the average English or French peasant, you're stuck with your basic fire pit and its attendant miseries. Chimneys exist, but they're expensive and found almost exclusively in the homes of the wealthy. A proper chimney requires skilled masonry work, which means hiring a stonemason, which means money most peasants don't have. Chimneys start appearing in wealthier homes during the 12th and 13th centuries, but they don't become common even among the middle class until well into the 14th and 15th centuries. If you're a peasant, you won't see a chimney in your home during your lifetime. You'll see them in the Lord's manor house when you go to pay your taxes, and you'll look at them with a mixture of envy and incomprehension. The wealthy, speaking of whom, have it better, but not as much better as you might think. Their homes are larger, which means they're harder to heat. Stone construction, which nobles favour for security and prestige, is absolutely terrible from a thermal perspective. Stone is a wonderful thermal mass, which means it absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, but that only helps if you can get the stone warm in the first place. In winter, stone walls act like giant heat sinks, drawing warmth out of the interior and radiating cold inward. Noble homes have fireplaces, actual built-in fireplaces with chimneys, but these are less efficient than you'd think. Medieval fireplaces are huge, designed to burn entire tree trunks, because they need that much fuel to generate meaningful heat. The problem is that most of that heat goes straight up the chimney. A medieval fireplace might be 5 or 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall. You could literally walk into some of them. All that size means tremendous airflow up the chimney, drawing heated air out of the room and creating a vacuum that pulls cold air in from every crack and gap in the walls. The net effect is that you're warm if you're standing directly in front of the fire, freezing if you're anywhere else. The wealthy partially solve this by having multiple fireplaces, sometimes one in every room, but they can't keep all the fireplaces burning all the time, because that would require a small forest worth of wood every day, so they heat the rooms they're using and abandon the rest of the house to the cold. This creates its own problems. Moisture from breath and bodies condenses on the cold stone walls of unheated rooms, freezing overnight and creating ice inside the castle. Medieval castles in winter are described in chronicles as being so cold that ink froze in its bottles, wine froze in its casks, and people could see their breath even in supposedly heated rooms. Windows are another major thermal problem. Glass windows exist in the medieval period, but they're extraordinarily expensive. Glass is made by heating sand and other materials to extremely high temperatures, then blowing or casting it into shape. The process requires skilled craftsmen, specialized equipment, and considerable fuel. The result is a luxury item affordable only to the very wealthy. Even then, medieval glass isn't like modern glass. It's often greenish or yellowish, full of bubbles and imperfections, and it lets in light but doesn't provide much of a view. Most people don't have glass windows. They have openings in their walls that can be covered with shutters, cloth, oiled parchment, or animal bladders stretched thin enough to let light through. These coverings provide some protection against wind and precipitation, but zero insulation. In winter, you face a constant choice. Close your shutters and sit in darkness, or open them and let in the cold. Most people compromise by opening shutters during the brief daylight hours to let in some light, then closing them as soon as the sun sets. Even wealthy homes with glass windows cover them with heavy curtains or shutters in winter, because single-pane glass provides almost no insulation. Documents from Westminster Palace in London describe workers installing additional shutters over existing glass windows because the drafts were so severe. If that's what people are dealing with in a royal palace, imagine what peasants are coping with. There's another heating source that everyone uses: animals. Medieval people routinely share their living space with livestock in winter. Your cow, if you have one, lives in the same room you do. So do your chickens, your pig if you're lucky, and possibly a goat or sheep. This sounds insane from a modern perspective, and it is genuinely unpleasant. The smell is overwhelming. The noise is constant. The animals poop inside your house, adding to the general filth and increasing disease risk. But the thermal benefit is undeniable. A cow produces a tremendous amount of body heat. Medieval estimates suggest that a single cow can raise the temperature of a small room by several degrees simply through its metabolic heat. Multiple animals crowded together create a meaningful thermal boost. This is why Viking longhouses and medieval European peasant homes so often included space for animals at one end of the structure. The animals are separated from the human living space by a low wall or partition, but the heat flows over. It's not pleasant, but it works. The downside, beyond the obvious ones, is disease transmission. Living in close quarters with animals means constant exposure to zoonotic diseases, illnesses that can jump from animals to humans. Medieval people don't understand germ theory, so they don't make the connection between housing their tubercular cow in the same room where their children sleep and the fact that those children keep getting sick. But we can make that connection, and it's grim. The very thing that helps them survive winter is also slowly killing them. Bed arrangements in winter are all about thermal efficiency. Everyone sleeps together, partly for warmth, partly because space is limited, partly because beds are expensive. You have a wooden frame, if you're lucky, with ropes strung across it to support a mattress. That mattress is a large cloth sack filled with straw, sometimes with a wool. Blanket on top as padding, and everyone piles on. Bodies pressed together share heat. Children burrow between adults. Everyone's covered with shared blankets or cloaks. Medieval people also understood the principle of creating a warm microclimate around your bed. Better-off households have bed curtains, fabric hangings that enclose the bed on all sides, creating a small, insulated space. Your breath and body heat warm this enclosed area, making it significantly warmer than the surrounding room. The curtains are heavy fabric, wool or linen, and they stay closed as much as possible. You're essentially sleeping in a cloth cave, which isn't comfortable but is warmer than the alternative. All of this, the wattle and daub walls, the thatched roof, the fire pit, the smoke, the animals, the communal sleeping, creates a living environment that's barely tolerable in summer and nearly unbearable in winter. You're cold all the time. Not uncomfortably chilly, but bone-deep, exhausting cold that makes every movement difficult and every day a struggle. Your home isn't a sanctuary. It's just a slightly less hostile environment than the outside, a thin barrier between you and the elements that sometimes seems like it's barely worth maintaining. But you maintain it anyway because the alternative is worse. Winter in medieval Europe wasn't a vacation. It wasn't a time to rest by the fire and wait for spring. It was a different kind of brutal work, a constant struggle to stay warm, stay fed, and keep your household functioning. The nature of work changed in winter, but it never stopped. Let's talk about what that actually looked like. If you're a farmer, which again you almost certainly are, winter means a dramatic shift in your daily routine. During the growing season, you're working from dawn until dark in the fields, ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting. The work is backbreaking, but at least it's straightforward. In winter, field work isn't possible. The ground is frozen solid, too hard to plough even if you had a reason to. Snow covers everything. So what do? First, there are the animals. If you own livestock, they need constant care, and winter makes that care infinitely more difficult. Your cow, assuming you have one and it survived the autumn slaughter, needs to be fed and watered daily. But there's no grass in winter. You're feeding her stored hay, which you hopefully gathered enough of during summer. Medieval hay production was far less efficient than modern methods, so you're constantly worried about running out before spring. Every flake of hay you pull from your dwindling stack is one less for tomorrow. Water for animals is a special challenge. The stream is frozen. The pond is frozen. You need to break ice twice a day, morning and evening, to let your animals drink. This means hauling your heaviest tool, an axe or a heavy wooden mallet, to the water source and spending precious energy smashing through ice that gets thicker every day. Your hands, already damaged by cold and frostbite, take additional punishment from the jarring impact and the ice water that splashes on them. In particularly cold spells, the ice refreezes so quickly that you need to break it, let the animal drink immediately, and then it's frozen again by the next day. Mucking out the animal shelter is another daily task. The animals produce prodigious amounts of waste, and in winter, that waste freezes into solid chunks that are nearly impossible to move. You're supposed to muck out regularly to prevent disease and to gather the manure for fertilizing next year's fields. But in practice, the frozen dung pile becomes a nearly insurmountable obstacle. Many medieval farmers simply gave up on regular cleaning during the worst weeks of winter, letting the waste accumulate and dealing with the consequences come spring. Beyond animal care, there's firewood. Always, constantly, obsessively, there's firewood. Your family's survival depends on keeping the fire burning, and fire requires fuel. You need to gather, process, and store enough wood to last from November through March or April, and that's a tremendous amount of wood. One estimate suggests a medieval household burned between 2 and 4 cords of wood per winter, and a cord is a stack measuring 8 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. That's a small mountain of wood. Gathering this wood is a year-round task, but winter makes it especially urgent and difficult. You're competing with every other household for limited resources. The Lord technically owns all the trees, so you're restricted to deadfall, dead branches, old stumps, anything that's already fallen or dead. You trudge through snow, dragging a wooden sled or carrying bundles on your back, gathering every stick and branch you can find. Your fingers are numb, your back aches. The load you're carrying weighs you down, and the walk back to your home through deep snow is exhausting. Once you've gathered the wood, you need to process it. Larger branches need to be broken or chopped into pieces small enough to burn efficiently. This requires a good axe, which not everyone has, and considerable strength, which winter's malnutrition makes scarce. You can't chop wet wood because it won't split cleanly, but you also can't wait for it to dry because you need it now. So you're constantly battling with half-frozen, partially thawed wood that's slick with ice and refuses to split properly. Storing the wood presents its own problems. You want it close to your house so you don't have to trudge through snow every time you need to feed the fire, but you also need to keep it dry enough to burn well. Many families stack wood against the outside wall of their house, covering it with whatever they have: straw, old cloth, animal hides. But snow finds its way into everything, and you're often burning wood that's at least partially damp, which produces even more smoke and less heat. For women, winter work shifts indoors, but remains relentless. Spinning wool is a constant winter activity. You're preparing the wool that was sheared last spring, carding it to align the fibres, then spinning it into thread using a drop spindle. This is painstaking, time-consuming work that requires good light, which winter doesn't provide. You're working by firelight, straining your eyes in the dim, smoky interior, your fingers moving by memory as much as sight. And you need a lot of thread because you're going to weave it into cloth, and that cloth will become clothing, blankets, everything textile in your household. Weaving, if you have a loom, is another winter task. Medieval looms are simple affairs, basically vertical frames with weights hanging from warp threads. You pass the weft thread back and forth, building up fabric slowly, inches per day. It's meditative work, or it would be if you weren't freezing, hungry, and worried about whether your children are going to survive until spring. The cloth you produce is rough, scratchy, and full of slubs and irregularities, but it's yours, and it's warmer than nothing. Mending is endless. In a world where new clothes are incredibly expensive and rare, you patch and repair until there's more patch than original garment. Sewing by firelight with numb fingers and primitive needles is an exercise in patience. Thread breaks constantly. Your stitches are uneven. But you persist because that torn tunic is the only one your son has, and if you don't patch it, he'll freeze. Food preparation in winter is more complicated than in other seasons. You're dealing with preserved foods that need careful handling. Salt pork has to be soaked to remove excess salt before cooking, otherwise it's inedible. Dried peas and beans need to be soaked overnight, which means planning ahead and also dealing with water that freezes in the soaking pot. Making bread is a production that involves preparing the dough, letting it rise near the fire, and then either baking it yourself in a skillet or, if you're lucky enough to have access to a communal oven, hauling the dough through snow to the baker. Preparing pottage, that eternal medieval staple, takes hours. You've got a pot hanging over your fire, and into it goes water, grains, whatever vegetables you have left, maybe a bit of salted meat if you're fortunate. It has to simmer for a long time to become edible, and the pot can't be left unattended because the fire needs constant management. Too much fire and your pottage burns. Too little, and it never cooks. The pot is heavy, the hook it hangs from is clumsy, and you're doing all of this while trying to keep children away from the fire and managing your other tasks. Children's work in winter is significant. As soon as they're old enough to be useful, around age 5 or 6, children are contributing labour to the household's survival. Young children watch younger children, freeing adults for harder tasks. They feed chickens, collect eggs if the chickens are still, laying, which in winter they often aren't. They help card wool, a tedious task well suited to small fingers. They're sent to gather kindling, small sticks and twigs that are easier for them to carry than the larger wood adults gather. Older children, pre-teens and teenagers, do adult-level work. Boys help with wood gathering and animal care, learning the skills they'll need as adults. Girls are fully involved in wool processing, cooking, and household management. By age 12 or 13, a medieval child is performing essentially the same work as an adult, minus only the tasks requiring maximum strength. And it's important to understand that all of this work is made exponentially harder by the cold. Modern people have some concept of cold weather work because we have outdoor winter jobs. But modern winter work happens with proper clothing, insulated gloves, warm boots, and the knowledge that you can go inside to a heated building when you're done. Medieval people have none of that. You're working in inadequate clothing, with damaged hands and feet, knowing that the warm interior you're returning to is barely warmer than outside. The cold affects everything. It makes your joints ache, reducing your range of motion and making every movement painful. It numbs your extremities, making fine motor control nearly impossible. Your damaged, frostbitten fingers can barely grip tools. Tasks that would be simple in summer become monumental challenges. Threading a needle, tying a knot, holding an axe, everything is harder. Malnutrition makes it worse. By midwinter, you're running low on stored food. You're hungry, not just regular hungry, but deep, gnawing, constant hunger. Your body is desperately trying to maintain core temperature, which requires calories, but you don't have enough calories, so your body starts burning its own muscle for fuel. You lose weight, you lose strength. Tasks that were difficult in November become nearly impossible by February. Disease compounds the problem: winter diseases, respiratory infections, influenza, pneumonia sweep through communities. You're sick, or recovering from being sick, or about to get sick. Working while ill in medieval winter isn't optional. There's no sick leave. No one can afford to rest. So you work through illness, which makes you sicker, which makes the illness last longer and increases your chances of dying from it. And underlying all of this is the psychological toll. Winter darkness is oppressive. The sun rises late and sets early. You're spending the majority of your time in darkness, or near darkness, working by flickering firelight that barely illuminates your hands in front of your face. The darkness feeds depression, a constant weight that makes every task feel futile. You're cold, hungry, sick, exhausted, and wondering if spring will ever come. Many people simply gave up, succumbing to what medieval chroniclers described as melancholia or acedia, a deep spiritual and psychological exhaustion. Some specialized workers had different winter routines. Blacksmiths, for instance, continued working through winter because their forges provided heat and because tools needed constant repair. But working a forge in winter had its own challenges. The contrast between the searing heat of the forge and the bitter cold of the surrounding air was physically jarring. Sweat froze on your skin. Burns and cold injuries happened simultaneously. Millers continued operating as long as water wheels kept turning, which they didn't always do if the millrace froze. When mills shut down, communities lost their ability to grind grain into flour, which meant eating whole grains boiled into porridge rather than bread. This was less nutritious and less filling, adding to winter's nutritional crisis. Merchants and traders had perhaps the worst of it. Trade didn't stop in winter, but it became incredibly dangerous. Roads, already terrible in medieval times, became impassable with snow. Rivers froze, eliminating water transport. Travel time between towns doubled or tripled. The risk of getting caught in a blizzard and freezing to death was substantial. Yet trade continued because communities needed goods they couldn't produce themselves. Salt, iron, certain foods. Travelling merchants paid a high price for their winter journeys, and many didn't survive to see spring. The irony of medieval winter work is that you're working desperately hard just to maintain status quo. You're not building anything or producing surplus. You're engaged in a months-long battle to not lose ground, to keep your family alive, to preserve enough resources to make it to spring when the cycle can begin again. It's exhausting, demoralizing work with no real reward beyond survival. And yet, people did it. Year after year, generation after generation, they endured medieval winter and its brutal demands. Because what else could they do? Let's talk about eating, or more accurately, about trying to eat in medieval winter when food is scarce, storage is inadequate, and every meal represents a tiny victory over starvation. If you thought medieval food in general was bland and monotonous, winter food is that, but also deeply anxiety-inducing, because you're watching your supplies dwindle with no way to replenish them. Food preservation was the cornerstone of winter survival, and medieval people knew this. The months of August, September and October were consumed with frantic efforts to preserve as much food as possible before winter arrived. Salt was your primary weapon in this fight. Salt draws moisture out of food, creating an environment where bacteria can't thrive. Medieval people used salt so extensively that the salt trade was one of the most important economic activities in Europe. Salt mines and salt works dotted the continent, producing the mineral that made winter survival possible. Meat preservation began with salting. When you slaughter an animal in autumn, you need to process that meat immediately. You can't refrigerate it. You can't freeze it, at least not reliably. You salt it. This means cutting the meat into manageable pieces, rubbing each piece thoroughly with salt, and then packing them in barrels with layers of salt between each layer of meat. The salt slowly draws out moisture, turning the flesh hard, dark, and barely recognizable as meat. Properly salted meat could last months, even through winter and into spring. But salted meat is brutally unpleasant to eat. The salt content is so high that you must soak it in water, often for a full day, before it's edible. Even then, it's tough, incredibly salty, and flavoured more by salt than by any memory of the animal it came from. But it's protein, and in winter, protein is precious. You eat it because the alternative is starvation, not because it's enjoyable. Smoking was another preservation method, often combined with salting. You hang meat in a smokehouse, a small structure with a low smouldering fire that produces lots of smoke. The smoke contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth and also adds flavour. Smoked pork, smoked fish, these were winter staples. The smoking process could take days or even weeks, and someone needed to constantly monitor the fire, keeping it smoking but not burning too hot. Well-smoked meat would last even longer than salted meat, and many people preferred the flavour, though prefer is a relative term when you're talking about preserved medieval meat. Fish was preserved through a combination of salting and drying. Cod was particularly important in Northern Europe. Fishermen caught huge quantities during late summer, and these were gutted, salted and then dried until they became hard as boards. These were stockfish, and they were a crucial protein source. Like salted meat, stockfish had to be soaked before eating, and even then it was tough and required extensive boiling to become even remotely palatable. Vegetables were pickled, a process that involved submerging them in brine or vinegar. Cabbage became sauerkraut through fermentation, a process that medieval people understood empirically, even if they didn't understand the microbiology behind it. Cucumbers, onions, turnips all went into pickling solutions. The resulting vegetables were sour, salty and unrecognisable, but they provided some vitamins and variety to an otherwise monotonous diet. Root vegetables could be stored without special preservation if you had a good root cellar. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, beets. These could last through winter if kept cool and dry. Root cellars were underground storage areas where temperatures stayed just above freezing, cold enough to prevent sprouting but not cold enough to freeze the vegetables solid. Not everyone had a root cellar, and even if you did, rodents were a constant problem. Rats and mice loved your stored vegetables as much as you did, and they had all winter to gnaw their way through your supplies. Grains were, stored in large wooden containers, pottery jars, or even woven baskets sealed with clay. Keeping grain dry was critical. Damp grain moulded quickly, and mouldy grain could kill you. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, produces compounds that cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Medieval people didn't know what caused ergot poisoning. They just knew that sometimes grain went bad and people who ate it went mad or died. Storage containers needed to be sealed against moisture and checked regularly for signs of spoilage. But even with careful preservation, food supplies ran low as winter progressed. By January, you're starting to ration. By February, rations are getting tight. By March, you're desperately trying to stretch what remains until the first spring vegetables appear, which won't be until late April if you're lucky. This period, late winter into early spring, was known as the Hungry Gap, and it killed people. Your winter diet, such as it is, revolves around pottage. This is a thick stew made from whatever you have available. Start with water. Add grains, barley or oats most commonly, wheat if you're fortunate. Throw in some preserved vegetables if you have any, maybe a bit of salt pork if you're feeling extravagant or if it's a feast day. Let it simmer for hours until everything softens into a greyish, lumpy mass that has the consistency of thin porridge. This is what you eat, twice a day, every day for months. The monotony is crushing. The same food day after day. There's no variety, no surprise. You know exactly what breakfast will taste like because it's the same thing you had yesterday and the day before and every day for the past 3 months. The boredom of medieval winter diet is a kind of psychological torture. Your body craves variety, different flavours, different textures, but there is none. You eat to survive, not for pleasure. Bread, if you have it, is dark, heavy, and made from coarse flour. Wheat flour is for the rich. You're eating bread made from rye, barley, or oats, often bulked out with ground peas or even acorns in bad years. The bread is dense enough to be used as a plate, which is exactly what medieval people do. Cut a thick slice, pile food on top, let the bread absorb the juices, then eat the bread last when it's soaked and somewhat more palatable. Fresh food doesn't exist in winter. There are no fruits except perhaps some wrinkled apples you stored in the cellar and are now half rotted. There are no vegetables except root vegetables that are starting to sprout and look less appetizing by the day. There's no fresh meat unless you're wealthy enough to slaughter an animal in winter, which most people aren't because keeping animals alive is valuable. Chickens might still be producing eggs, but winter egg production drops to nearly nothing because chickens need light and warmth to lay, and winter provides neither. Milk is also scarce. Cows need to calve to produce milk, and most calving happens in spring, so that milk production peaks when grass is growing and the cows have plenty to eat. In winter, milk production is minimal or non-existent. You might have stored cheese, which keeps better than milk, but cheese production requires milk, so if there's no summer milk surplus, there's no winter cheese. The nutritional situation is grim. You're getting enough calories to survive, barely, but the quality of those calories is poor. Vitamin C is almost completely absent from your diet, putting you at risk for scurvy. Vitamin D, which your body produces from sunlight, is also scarce because winter days are short, and you spend most of your time inside a dark, smoky hovel. The lack of fresh food means you're missing countless micronutrients that your body needs. The effects of this nutritional deprivation are visible and cumulative. Your hair becomes brittle and falls out. Your gums bleed. Your skin develops sores that won't heal. Your wounds, if you have any, fester because your immune system is compromised. Children's growth is stunted. Pregnant women face increased risks of miscarriage and stillbirth. The elderly simply fade away, their bodies unable to cope with the combined stresses of cold and malnutrition. And then there are the truly bad years. Years when harvest failed the previous summer. Years when the storage methods didn't work and food spoiled. Years when war or raiders or simple bad luck meant you didn't have enough food preserved to make it through winter. These were the years when famine struck, and famine in medieval Europe was a recurring horror. The The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 stands as perhaps the worst example, but it was far from the only one. The famine began with terrible weather in 1314, cold and wet conditions that continued through 1315 and into 1316. Crops failed, animals died, and by winter of 1315, Northern Europe was facing starvation on a massive scale. During the Great Famine, food prices soared to levels that made even the basics unaffordable. A bushel of wheat that normally sold for a few shillings might cost 20 times that amount. Salt, crucial for preservation, became so expensive that people couldn't afford to preserve meat even when they had animals to slaughter. The knock-on effects were catastrophic. Without preserved meat, people slaughtered animals earlier than they should have, eating them when food was still somewhat available, rather than preserving them for the depths of winter. Then, when winter arrived in full force, there was nothing left. Chronicles from the period describe scenes that are almost incomprehensible in their horror. People eating bark stripped from trees, grass when they could find it under the snow, leather boiled into a gelatinous mass and consumed out of desperation, mud eaten in the hopes that it contained something nutritious. There are accounts of people simply lying down in the snow and dying, too weak from hunger to continue. Bodies accumulated through the winter, too, many to bury properly, and remained frozen until spring thaw revealed the full scale of the catastrophe. The chroniclers also mention cannibalism, though historians debate how widespread this actually was. The accounts might be exaggerations, medieval writers prone to hyperbole when describing disasters, but even if only some of the accounts are true, the fact that people were driven to consider eating human flesh tells you everything about how desperate the situation was. The Great Famine killed between 5 and 12% of the population of Northern Europe. Millions dead, entire villages abandoned, communities destroyed. The famine lasted years, and even after harvests improved in 1317, it took until 1322 for food supplies to return to pre-famine levels. The population wouldn't fully recover until the 1320s, and by then society had changed. Trust in traditional authorities, particularly the church, had been shaken. The social fabric had frayed, and people lived with the memory of those terrible years, knowing that it could happen again, because it did happen again. Famine was a recurring feature of medieval life. Not every year, not every winter, but often enough that everyone knew stories of the hungry times. Often enough that people planned their lives around the possibility of famine. Often enough that parents made terrible choices about which children to feed fully and which to let slowly starve. Often enough that winter wasn't just uncomfortable or difficult. It was potentially lethal, a season where you might simply run out of food before spring arrived. Even in non-famine years, hunger was your companion through winter. The constant gnawing in your belly, the weakness in your limbs, the foggy thinking that comes from inadequate nutrition. You dreamed about food, not fancy food, not feasts, just enough. Enough bread to feel full, enough meat to satisfy the craving your body had for protein, enough of anything to not feel hungry for one blessed moment. When spring finally arrived and the first green shoots appeared in the fields, medieval people went slightly mad with relief and hunger. They ate the new growth, even though eating too much too fast after months of near starvation could make you sick or kill you. But the temptation was overwhelming. Fresh food, green food, the promise that hunger might finally end. This was winter eating. This was the gnawing anxiety that accompanied every meal, knowing that this food was coming from a finite supply that was shrinking every day. This was the arithmetic of survival, counting days until spring and portions remaining, hoping the math worked out in your favour. Often, it didn't. Let's address the elephant in the icy room. Medieval winter killed people. Not just a few people, not just the unlucky or the elderly. Winter killed in wholesale lots, reaping through communities with grim efficiency and leaving survivors to wonder who'd be next. If malnutrition and hypothermia didn't get you, disease probably would. And if disease didn't, injury might. And if you somehow dodged all of those, there was always the slow, cumulative damage of repeated winters gradually destroying your body until it simply gave out. Hypothermia is the most obvious threat. Your body needs to maintain a core temperature of around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit to function properly. When your core temperature drops below 95 degrees, you're clinically hypothermic. Below 90 degrees, you're in serious danger. Below 85 degrees, you're probably going to die. Medieval people didn't have thermometers, so they didn't know these specific numbers, but they understood the progression intimately. You got cold, then very cold, then you stopped shivering, then you felt warm, paradoxically, as your body shut down peripheral blood flow to protect vital organs. Then you died. The insidious thing about hypothermia is that it can develop slowly. You don't need to fall through ice or get caught in a blizzard to become hypothermic. You can develop it just from living in a chronically cold environment, which describes every medieval peasant dwelling in winter. Your body is constantly losing heat to the environment, and if you can't generate enough heat through metabolic processes, your core temperature slowly drops. Day by day, degree by degree, until your body can't function anymore. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. Children have higher surface area relative to body mass, which means they lose heat faster. Infants can't shiver, which is the body's primary means of generating emergency heat. The elderly have reduced metabolic rates and poorer circulation, making it harder to maintain core temperature. Medieval winter was especially deadly for these populations. Infant mortality rates were already horrific, with perhaps a third of children dying before age 5, and winter made those odds even worse. Frostbite was endemic. This happens when tissue actually freezes, ice crystals forming in your cells and tearing them apart. Extremities are affected first because your body, in its desperate attempt to protect your core, constricts blood vessels in your fingers, toes, nose, and ears. Medieval people lost toes to frostbite regularly, lost fingers, lost portions of their ears, lost their noses in extreme cases. The process was agonizing, the tissue turning white, then waxy and hard, then black as it died. Eventually the dead tissue would slough off, or more often become infected and spread sepsis through your system. There was no treatment for frostbite. The standard advice was to warm the affected area gradually, not rapidly, because rapid warming causes even more tissue damage. But medieval people didn't have the luxury of controlled warming. You thrust your frozen hands toward the fire because you were desperate for warmth, and the rapid temperature change destroyed tissue that might have survived with gentler treatment. Then the tissue died, became infected, and you either lost the limb or died from sepsis. Chilblains were a less severe but more common cold injury. These are painful inflammations of the small blood vessels in your skin, caused by repeated exposure to cold. Your feet, particularly, suffered from chilblains. The tissue would become inflamed, red, swollen, and incredibly itchy. It burned and ached simultaneously. Chilblains could break open, becoming sores that wouldn't heal in the cold, damp conditions of medieval winter. Almost every medieval person suffered from chilblains to some degree. But cold-related injuries were just the beginning. Winter disease was the real killer. Respiratory infections swept through communities with devastating effect. Pneumonia, an infection of the lungs, was particularly deadly. Your lungs fill with fluid, making it progressively harder to breathe. You develop a rattling cough. You spike a high fever. You feel like you're drowning from the inside. Without antibiotics, which wouldn't be discovered for another 600 years, pneumonia killed approximately 30% of the people who contracted it, higher percentages among children and elderly. Bronchitis, influenza, and various upper respiratory infections were also common. The conditions were perfect for disease spread. You're crowded together in poorly ventilated spaces, breathing each other's air, coughing and sneezing on each other. The smoke from your fire irritates your respiratory system, making you more susceptible to infection. The cold air damages the protective mucous membranes in your nose and throat. Your immune system is compromised by malnutrition and stress. Disease finds you remarkably easy to infect. The spread of disease through medieval communities was fast and thorough. One person gets sick. Within days, their entire household is sick. Within a week, half the village is sick. There's no isolation, no quarantine. Sick people continue working because they have to. They continue living in close quarters because there's nowhere else to go. The disease spreads until everyone has been exposed, and then you just wait to see who recovers and who doesn't. Medieval people understood that winter brought disease, but they didn't understand why. The prevailing theory was miasma, bad air. They thought disease was caused by breathing corrupt air, which wasn't entirely wrong given that respiratory diseases are airborne, but they fundamentally misunderstood the mechanism. This led to treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Bloodletting was a standard treatment for almost everything. You're sick? Let's drain a pint or two of blood to balance your humours. Never mind that you're already weakened by illness and malnutrition. Never mind that you need that blood. The theory said bloodletting restored balance, so bloodletting it was. Leeches were applied, veins were opened, blood was collected in bowls. Patients survived these treatments in spite of them, not because of them. Herbal remedies had more mixed results. Some medieval herbs actually did have medicinal properties. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, and was used for pain and fever. Honey has antibacterial properties and was used on wounds. Various herbs had mild antiseptic or anti-inflammatory effects. But many remedies were based on the doctrine of signatures, the bizarre belief that plants resembling body parts would heal those body parts. Walnut looked like a brain, so it must be good for brain ailments. Lung-shaped lichen must cure lung diseases. It was medicinal nonsense, but it was the best they had. Childbirth in winter was particularly hazardous. Giving birth is always risky in pre-modern conditions, but winter added extra dangers. The cold environment meant shock was more likely. The lack of proper hygiene meant infection was common. The malnutrition meant both mother and baby were already compromised. Midwives did their best, working by firelight in freezing conditions, but maternal mortality rates were horrific. Perhaps 1 in 10 births resulted in the mother's death, higher in winter. Babies born in winter faced terrible odds. They needed to be kept warm, but how do you keep a newborn warm in a dwelling that's barely above freezing? You swaddle them in every scrap of cloth you have. You keep them close to the fire, risking burns. You have mother and baby sleeping together, sharing body heat, which increases the risk of the mother accidentally smothering the infant during sleep. Winter babies had lower survival rates than babies born in other seasons, and the ones who did survive often showed stunted growth from the malnutrition and cold exposure. Death in winter was so common it was almost routine. The old died, their worn-out bodies finally giving up under winter's assault. The young died, their not yet strong bodies unable to fight off disease. The sick died, the injured died, and people just accepted it with a grim fatalism. Death was everywhere in medieval life, but winter concentrated it, made it omnipresent. Handling death in winter presented its own challenges. Bodies needed to be buried, but the ground was frozen solid. Digging a grave in frozen earth was nearly impossible. You'd need to light fires on the ground to thaw it, then dig frantically before it froze again. A labour-intensive process that required resources most people didn't have. So bodies often waited for spring thaw, stored in outbuildings or even just left covered with snow, preserved by the cold until burial became possible. The psychological impact of living with death was immense. You knew that some percentage of your family, your community, wouldn't survive until spring. You watched children sicken and die. You watched elderly parents fade away. You watched neighbours discovered dead in their homes, frozen or starved or killed by disease, and you couldn't process this grief properly because you were too busy surviving. Grief was a luxury. Mourning would come later, if you lived. Right now, you had to focus on not becoming the next corpse. Medieval people developed coping mechanisms. Religion offered the promise of a better afterlife. which made death slightly less terrifying. Communities banded together, sharing resources and supporting each other through losses. Stoicism became a survival trait. You couldn't afford to break down every time someone died, so you learned to accept it, to move on, to keep functioning. This might sound callous, but it was necessary. The alternative was despair, and despair in medieval winter was a death sentence. But acceptance didn't mean death didn't hurt. Parents mourned children. Children mourned parents. Spouses mourned each other. The grief was real and deep, just suppressed under the immediate demands of survival. Winter broke hearts as surely as it broke bodies, leaving scars that never quite healed. This was the dark reality of medieval winter. The cold didn't just make life uncomfortable, it killed efficiently and remorselessly. Every winter was a gauntlet you had to run, knowing that some of you wouldn't make it to the other side. And if you did make it, if you survived, you carried the trauma with you, the knowledge that next winter would bring the same threats, the same fears, the same grim arithmetic of survival. Medieval winter wasn't just physically dark. It was socially isolating, psychologically oppressive, and utterly exhausting, in ways that had nothing to do with physical labour. The darkness itself was a challenge that modern people, accustomed to electric lights, can barely comprehend. In December and January at northern European latitudes, you might get 8 hours of daylight if you're lucky. That means 16 hours of darkness. 16 hours when you're functionally trapped inside your dark, cold, smoky hovel with the same people you've been trapped with for months. The shortness of winter days dominated everything. Dawn came late, around 8 a.m. or later. Sunset arrived early, by 4 p.m. in the darkest months. That narrow window of daylight had to be used intensively for all the tasks that required light. Anything requiring detail work, fine motor control, or clear vision had to happen during those precious hours. The rest of the time, you were sitting in darkness or near darkness, illuminated only by your fire. Artificial lighting existed but was expensive and inadequate. Candles were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, or from beeswax if you were wealthy. Tallow candles smoked terribly and smelled like burning fat, which they were. They provided light roughly equivalent to a modern nightlight, a feeble glow that barely pushed back the darkness. One candle cost a significant portion of a day's wages for a labourer, so you didn't use them casually. You saved them for emergencies or special occasions, making do with firelight the rest of the time. Rushlight, slightly cheaper, involved dipping dried rushes in, tallow and burning them. They burned quickly, lasting maybe an hour, and provided even less light than a candle. Oil lamps existed but required oil, which was expensive, and provided similar levels of illumination to candles. The wealthy could afford multiple candles or lamps, but even wealthy households were dim by modern standards. Castles at night were dark, shadowy places where people navigated by memory and the faint glow of widely spaced torches. For peasants, fire was your primary light source. The flames provided flickering, inconstant illumination that made reading impossible, even if you could read, which you probably couldn't. Fine work was nearly impossible. You could do gross motor tasks by firelight, but anything requiring precision had to wait for daylight. This meant your evenings, those long 16 hours of darkness, were spent in semi-darkness, doing very little beyond sitting, talking, and trying to stay warm. The boredom was crushing. You've been inside for months. You're with the same handful of people, day after day after day. You've heard all their stories. You've had all the conversations. You're sick of their presence and they're sick of yours. But there's nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. The psychological strain of this forced proximity was immense. Medieval people had no concept of personal space or privacy. You were never alone. Ever. You were always sharing space with family, and in winter, that sharing became claustrophobic. Fights were common. Tensions that simmered all winter would occasionally boil over into arguments, sometimes into physical violence. Medieval court records show spikes in domestic violence during winter months. The stress of cold, hunger, darkness, and constant proximity pushed people past their breaking points. Spouses fought, parents struck children, siblings squabbled. The violence was usually not severe, mostly because everyone was too malnourished and exhausted for sustained violence, but it was endemic. Communities tried to cope through various social structures. The church provided one outlet. Religious observances, numerous in medieval life, became even more important in winter. Attending Mass got you out of your house. It provided social interaction with neighbours. It offered the psychological comfort of communal prayer and the hope of divine intervention. The church building, while not warm, was at least different from your hovel, a change of scenery that broke the monotony. Winter also brought its own religious calendar. Christmas, the Nativity, was a major feast day, though medieval Christmas was less about gifts and more about religious observance and communal feasting. If the previous harvest had been decent, communities would pool resources for Christmas celebrations. There might be better food than usual, special ale, communal gatherings. These celebrations were vital psychological relief valves, brief moments of warmth and plenty in a season of cold and scarcity. Epiphany, Candlemas, various saints' days, these punctuated winter's darkness with moments of observance. They gave people something to look forward to, markers in the calendar that measured winter's slow passage. And they provided justification for gathering, for breaking the isolation, for being together in spaces other than your individual homes. Storytelling was a major winter entertainment. In the darkness, gathered around fires, people told stories, old tales passed down through generations, local gossip elevated to saga, religious stories, tales of saints and miracles, adventure stories featuring knights and dragons. These oral traditions were how medieval people preserved culture and history, but they were also how they survived winter nights. Stories provided distraction, entertainment, a way to pass the long dark hours. Music, for those who had instruments, was another diversion. Simple instruments, flutes, drums, stringed instruments, nothing sophisticated but enough to make music. Singing was common, songs everyone knew, work songs and drinking songs and religious hymns. Music didn't require light. It was something you could do in darkness, and it brought a kind of joy, or at least a break from misery. Games were played, dice games, gambling for small stakes, pebbles or sticks since no one had money to spare. Board games like Nine Men's Morris, played on boards scratched into wood or drawn in ash. Children played games too, though winter restricted active play. They stayed close to the fire, playing quiet games, telling their own stories, finding what joy they could in constrained circumstances. But entertainment couldn't fill all the hours. Much of winter was just enduring, sitting in silence because there was nothing left to say, staring at the fire because there was nothing else to look at, trying to sleep because sleep at least passed the time, though sleeping 16 hours a day while malnourished had its own problems. Your body needed the rest, but too much inactivity in cold conditions increased your risk of hypothermia and made your circulation problems worse. The isolation hit hardest in bad weather. Blizzards, heavy snow, these could trap you in your home for days. Travel between houses, even between neighbours, became dangerous or impossible. You might go weeks seeing no one except your immediate family. The psychological strain of this isolation, combined with all the other stresses of medieval winter, pushed people toward depression and despair. Medieval chroniclers wrote about winter melancholy, though they didn't use that term. They described people becoming quiet, withdrawn, uninterested in normal activities. They described unexplained deaths where people seemed to just give up, lying down and dying without any clear physical cause. Modern psychologists would probably diagnose this as depression with elements of seasonal affective disorder. But medieval people just knew that some people lost the will to live during winter. Community support systems were crucial. Neighbours checked on each other as much as weather allowed. Stronger families helped weaker ones, sharing food or fuel when they could spare it. The elderly and the sick received special attention, though often that attention was limited to just checking if they were still alive. The social fabric of medieval villages was tighter than modern communities, precisely because survival often depended on cooperation. Violence wasn't limited to domestic settings. Crime increased in winter, driven by desperation. Theft was common, breaking into storage buildings to steal food, taking firewood from someone else's pile. These crimes were driven by survival needs, not malice, but they were prosecuted harshly. A man caught stealing food might lose a hand, which in winter was essentially a death sentence since you couldn't work with one hand and couldn't survive winter unable to work. More serious crimes occasionally occurred, fights over resources that escalated to murder, assaults driven by winter madness. These were rare, mostly because everyone was too exhausted for serious violence, but they happened. Medieval justice was swift and brutal. Trials were perfunctory, punishment was harsh, and winter executions, hanging or worse, were attended by crowds who welcomed the spectacle as a break from boredom, though they'd never admit that publicly. The psychological toll of repeated winters accumulated over lifetimes. Medieval people who survived multiple harsh winters bore mental scars alongside their physical ones. They learned to dread winter, to fear its approach, to feel relief bordering on euphoria when it finally ended. The trauma was real and lasting, shaping medieval culture in ways that are hard for modern people to fully understand. But despite all the darkness, the isolation, the violence and the despair, medieval people also showed remarkable resilience. They survived. They maintained social bonds. They found moments of joy even in the darkest season. They sang songs. They told stories. They celebrated when they could. They supported each other. They endured. Because what other choice did they have? Some winters were merely terrible. Then there were the winters that became legendary, the catastrophic seasons that killed so many people, caused so much suffering that they echo through history even now. Let's talk about when winter stopped being just difficult and became apocalyptic. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 stands as the worst subsistence crisis in recorded European history, and it began with winter. Or rather, it began with the failure of normal seasonal patterns. The trouble started in 1314 with cold, wet summer weather that destroyed that year's harvest. But it was the winter of 1314 to 1315 that revealed the true scope of the disaster. That winter came early and stayed late, brutally cold with heavy snow. People went into winter with inadequate food stores, and they emerged, in spring already starving. Then came the catastrophic summer of 1315. It rained continuously, cold rain that prevented crops from ripening. The grain rotted in the fields. Hay couldn't be dried. Animals couldn't find fodder. And when winter of 1315 to 1316 arrived, it found northern Europe already on its knees. This second winter was the killer. Food stores that should have lasted until spring ran out by January. Communities that had survived the first winter collapsed during the second. Chronicles described the horror with stark simplicity. People ate anything. Bark stripped from trees became food. Grass, when it could be found under the snow. Leather goods, boiled until soft, consumed out of desperation. Cats, dogs, rats, anything with meat on it. Parents fed children their own blood, cutting themselves and letting the children drink, hoping to keep them alive a few more days. The children died anyway. By the winter of 1316 to 1317, the death toll was staggering. Estimates suggest between 5 and 12% of the population of Northern Europe died. In some regions, particularly in Ireland and parts of Germany, mortality rates reached 25% or higher. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went unplanted because there weren't enough people left to work them. The social fabric disintegrated. Traditional bonds of obligation between lords and peasants frayed as everyone fought for survival. That winter, 1316 to 1317, also saw the Great Bovine Pestilence, a cattle disease that killed up to 80% of herds in some areas. This compounded the famine catastrophically. Cattle weren't just food, they were labour. They pulled ploughs, hauled carts, provided milk and leather. Losing the cattle meant losing the ability to farm effectively, creating a cascading crisis that would take a generation to recover from. But the Great Famine wasn't the only catastrophic winter period. The winter of 1407-1408 was recorded as extraordinarily severe. It snowed continuously for weeks. Chroniclers wrote about birds freezing in flight, thousands of them dropping dead from the sky. Rivers froze solid. People froze to death inside their homes. The cold was so intense that normal winter precautions proved inadequate. This was the winter that introduced the metaphor too cold to snow, though that's meteorologically nonsense. But it captures how medieval people experienced that winter, cold beyond their conception of cold. The winter of 1434-35 was another legendary season. The Thames in London froze solid enough that markets were held on the ice. This became known as the First Frost Fair, though the term wouldn't be used for another 2 centuries. People walked across the river, horses and carts travelled on the ice. It seemed almost miraculous the great river turned to solid ground. But this marvel came at terrible cost. The river froze because temperatures were so low that even flowing water solidified. Thousands died that winter from cold and hunger. The winter of 1607 and 1680 saw England's first official frost fair on the Thames. The freeze began in late December 1607 and lasted through January. The ice was thick enough to support tents, vendors, even cooking fires. People roasted meat on the ice, sold goods, played football. These frost fairs became part of London legend, symbols of the Little Ice Age's grip on Europe. But they were also symptoms of climate crisis. Each frost fair represented winter so severe that a major river froze, and each occurred during periods of crop failure and famine. The Great Frost of 1683-84 was perhaps the most severe freeze recorded in England. The Thames froze for 2 months. Ice extended for miles along the coasts of the North Sea. The ice on the Thames reached 11 inches thick in London. Ships became trapped in ice, unable to move for months. Trade ceased, transportation collapsed, and people died in droves. This winter coincided with a period of already high mortality from plague and ongoing political turmoil, creating a crisis that seemed biblical in scope. During that terrible winter, the cold wasn't just extreme, but persistent. Temperatures barely rose above freezing during the day. At night, they plunged far below. Chronicler John Evelyn wrote about seeing the Thames completely frozen, about fowl dying from hunger and cold, about exotic plants in gardens killed by frost. He described London filled with smoke because the cold air trapped smoke from coal fires near ground level, creating a choking smog that made breathing difficult. The social impact of these catastrophic winters extended far beyond immediate mortality. They shook faith in social institutions. The Church, which claimed to intercede with God on behalf of the people, seemed powerless against winter's onslaught. No amount of prayer stopped the cold. No religious observance prevented starvation. This undermined religious authority and contributed to the later Protestant Reformation. Political authority also suffered. Lords and kings were supposed to protect their people, but they couldn't protect against winter. The feudal obligation worked both ways. Peasants served lords in exchange for protection, but winter revealed the limits of that protection. You couldn't fight winter with swords. You couldn't negotiate with blizzards. The social contract frayed as people realised their supposed protectors were as helpless as they were. Economic impacts rippled for years after catastrophic winters. Crop failures meant no seed for the next year's planting. Dead cattle meant no ploughing. Depleted populations meant insufficient labour. Recovery from a single bad winter took years. Recovery from multiple consecutive bad winters could take a generation. and before you'd fully recovered, another harsh winter would arrive, knocking you back down. Warfare was affected too. Military campaigns were supposed to halt in winter, but winter's severity made this even more strict. Armies couldn't march through deep snow. Supply lines couldn't function when rivers were frozen and roads impassable. Sieges became mutual death traps, attackers and defenders both suffering from cold and starvation. The 100 Years' War saw multiple campaigns disrupted or abandoned because winter made warfare literally impossible. There's also evidence that these catastrophic winters contributed to social upheaval and revolution. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 occurred after a period of harsh winters and poor harvests. The popular revolts that swept Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries often followed environmental crises. When people are starving and freezing, when normal social systems fail to protect them, they become willing to challenge authority in ways they wouldn't during good years. Medieval people try to understand these catastrophic winters in their own framework. To them, these weren't random weather events, but divine punishment. Severe winters were signs that God was angry, that society had fallen into sin and was being chastised. This interpretation led to various responses. Some communities intensified religious observance, hoping increased piety would end the suffering. Others looked for scapegoats, blaming Jews, heretics, or supposed witches for causing the bad weather through malice or magic. The witch trials that peaked in early modern Europe had roots in this kind of thinking. When winter was catastrophically bad, people demanded explanations. Bad weather wasn't satisfying, but someone caused this weather through evil magic, gave them someone to blame, someone to punish, someone who could be eliminated to perhaps restore normal conditions. Thousands of people, mostly women, were executed as witches partly because of this desperate need to explain and control winter's fury. Climate science tells us these catastrophic winters were part of the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling driven by complex factors, reduced solar radiation, increased volcanic activity, changes in ocean circulation, possibly even human impact through massive deforestation. But medieval people didn't have this understanding. They experienced the cold, the repeated failures of harvest, the grinding poverty, and they died without knowing why. Some winters were bad enough to be named. The year without summer in 1816, technically post-medieval but the culmination of Little Ice Age effects. The Great Frost, the Great Famine. These weren't just cold years, they were civilizational challenges, moments when European society tottered on the edge of collapse. That they survived at all is testament to human resilience, but the cost in lives and suffering was immense, and the truly frightening thing for medieval people was the unpredictability. You couldn't prepare for catastrophe. One winter might be mild, making you think the worst was over, then the next winter would be devastating. The cycle repeated, each harsh winter a reminder that you were never truly safe, that winter could kill you any year, and there was nothing you could do to guarantee survival except endure. This is what winter really meant in medieval times. Not just cold and darkness, though it was both. Not just hunger and disease, though it was those too. It meant living under constant threat, knowing that any winter could be the one that killed you or destroyed your community. It meant trauma, repeated and cumulative, shaping a civilization's character in profound ways. Medieval people survived these winters, but they paid a terrible price, measured in bodies frozen and starved, in communities destroyed, in trauma passed from generation to generation. They survived, but barely. And modern people, comfortable in our heated homes, can perhaps begin to understand what that really meant. So how was your day? You've woken frozen, worked until your body screamed in protest, eaten food that barely qualified as edible, watched people die around you, and faced the psychological toll of months of darkness and isolation. Still here? Still breathing? Congratulations. You've survived a single day of medieval winter, only another 90 to go before spring. The truth is you wouldn't last a week. Not being dramatic, not exaggerating. You, with your modern body that's never known real cold, never experienced true hunger, never lived without medical care or adequate shelter, you wouldn't make it 7 days in medieval winter. The cold would break you first, probably. The malnutrition would compound it. The disease would finish the job. And if somehow you survived the physical challenges, the psychological toll would crack you. The darkness, the isolation, the relentless nature of medieval winter, these aren't things modern people are equipped to handle. Medieval people survived because they had no choice. They were hardened by repeated exposure, adapted through generations of brutal selection. The people who couldn't handle winter died, often young, leaving only those with some combination of physical resilience and mental toughness. Even then, survival was never guaranteed. Strong people died, hardy people died, lucky people died. Winter killed without discrimination or mercy. But here's the thing worth remembering. They did survive. Generation after generation of medieval people faced winter and came through the other side. They suffered, they struggled, many died, but enough survived to continue, to have children, to pass on their genes and their knowledge. You're reading this now because your ancestors somewhere in your lineage survived medieval winters. They endured what would break us, and they did it year after year. When you feel that first cold snap of modern winter, when you reach for your thermostat or pull on your down jacket, take a moment to think about what winter really meant to your ancestors. Think about the cold that never ended, the hunger that never abated, the darkness that consumed most of every day. Think about them huddled, around inadequate fires, rationing disappearing food, wondering if spring would ever arrive. Then maybe say a quiet thank you to the modern world, to central heating and refrigeration, to modern medicine and food preservation, to electric lights and insulated homes. These aren't luxuries. They're the reason we survive winter without thinking twice about it. Medieval people would have considered them miracles beyond comprehension. And the next time winter feels inconvenient because you have to scrape your windshield or your heating bill is high, remember? You have no idea what real winter means. You wouldn't last a week in medieval times. None of us would. Good night. Stay warm.